So it's the last week before the balance patch that is going to be the seasonal. I don't expect too much to change just because of how long ago the seasonal patch had to get locked in, but I've made some compromises on the tier list. Number one, I've taken a lot of decks off that were in tier 3 because, like, it feels weird to just kind of have them on there. Tier 3 was getting really crowded. Like, Nightfall aggro was on there, for example, and, like, yeah, that deck is probably not disappearing entirely, but it's not a prominent point in the meta, so, like, every now and then I'll bring up some fringe playable decks that I actually think, like, spike the meta pretty hard, but for the most part, I'm going to try to keep things limited to what I would expect to see in, like, your average top cut, just to keep the tier list a little bit more consolidated. Also, I've made some compromises on, like, putting multiple region combination decks in the same tier. For example, I've got a Zero Aurelia and Sivir Zed in tier 1, and I'll kind of explain why as we get into it. So yeah, Draven Ezreal, TF Swain, Lee Sin, whatever. Let's talk about the focal point of the meta, which is Shurima Ionia. Are you running Sivir Zed? Are you running a Zero Aurelia? And that's kind of why both of these decks are in tier 1. Sivir Zed is better, but that also means it's more likely to be targeted, which is why a Zero Aurelia, I think, is also a very solid tier 1 choice. So when you're playing a lineup or starting to think about lineup composition, what you really need to start, as like your starting point, your baseline for this weekend, is like, am I banning the Shurima Ionia deck? Or am I leaving it open and trying to beat it? That should be like your starting point, figuring that out. Now, a lineup that's looking to ban it would be like your standard Lee Sin lineup that is like also running a Sivir Zed deck or something else. So like, even just taking out a tier 1, let's say like TF Swain, Lee Sin, and Draven Ezreal. Like, that's probably going to look to ban the Ionia and then just like take 3 of the much more solid decks of the format into whatever your opponent has remaining. Maybe you look to counter Lee Sin, any of those kinds of things, but, you know, that's like a lineup that's looking to ban the Sivir Zed and is like a fairly standard lineup. Then if you're looking to beat the Sivir Zed, if you're looking to, you know, leave open these Shurima Ionia lists, you're probably looking at something a little bit more abstract, like Nab, Shen Demacia, and discard aggro, I think, is probably something that's going to find a lot of success against a thing like that, which is one of the reasons that, like, discard aggro has moved up, as well as Shen Demacia and Nab. So Shen Demacia has moved up because, and mind you, this tournament tactician is going to be a little bit all over the place, bear with me, I'm trying out a new format a little bit, and also it's the last week, so we're going to try and get a little wet and wild here. One of the mirror breakers in Sivir Zed is Spirit's Refuge, and that stands to reason that barriers are going to be good in general, because the problem with Sivir is that she's really hard to kill. She has spell shield, so she's immune to spells. She has quick attack, so she's hard to block. And unless you have a challenger big enough, you really can't challenge into her, and even that is risky because things like Twin Disciplines are so effective in terms of buffing up the defense that even if you have a 3-attack challenger, the chances that you actually are going to kill a Sivir is pretty low. Now, I'm not sure what barrier spells are best for Shen Demacia. You know, Prismatic Barrier is great because it's the cheapest. Spirit's Refuge is cool because you need the lifesteal against something like a Zero Aurelia, or even Sivir Zed sometimes. But Riposte lets you play around Twin Disciplines while still getting Barrier, and that's kind of why Shen Demacia has moved up so far. Not only are barriers phenomenal into the Sivir Zed that we're seeing, but you also have the introduction of Pod. Even Greenglade Lookout is something that players have been experimenting with. Now, the list that I have here is taking up Brightsteel Formation. I think that's a little bit too late game for the meta that we're finding ourselves in, because if you are looking to ban or even leave open the Sivir Auction, like, you're probably not getting to turn 9 with an established board. You're usually trying to, like, eat up their resources and then sort of win a value game from there, and I don't think Formation is something that's going to allow you to do that more than it is going to just sit dead in your hand. So if you're running the Greenglade Lookouts, by all means, usually these are capping out at one of the boats, be it Shen or Jarvan. Shen's a little bit more popular, but that's really kind of like where you have to start, is like, am I beating this? Am I leaving it open? Because Shen Demacia, if you are not looking to leave open Sivir Zed, if you're playing a lineup with Shen Demacia where you're looking to ban that, you have a little bit more of an awkward spacing, because I don't think you're doing phenomenal against, like, these Noxus control decks that we find in the format. While you can out-tempo Lee Sin, I wouldn't count on it, so, you know, if you are banning this, you have to think about what you're playing against, and these are some top contenders. Yeah, you could probably beat discard aggro if you pack in 3 Spirits Refuge, but I think Shen Demacia is a little bit on the weaker side in terms of the finalized builds that we have. I'm really waiting for someone to find something that knocks my socks off and be like, okay, yeah, this is the build for Shen Jarvan, because I don't think we've found it yet. We're close. We're definitely close, but I don't think we've found it yet. Same thing with TF Swain. I feel like the lists that we saw at the start of the meta are pretty different from the lists that we're seeing now. We cut Line 'em Up, we cut a couple of things, but ultimately, I don't think I've ever, like, been in love with the TF Swain list that I've seen, so hopefully there's just a little bit more experimentation that we see out. And if you do want to drop the Swain for the Gangplank, I am not well versed in how that impacts the matchup charts personally. It's something that's a little bit harder to dig into, and I'll definitely do my research once we get into the seasonal meta, but like for now, I'm keeping it a little light and breezy, just kind of going on the baseline knowledges that I have. So that's kind of like what Tier 1 is duking it out for right now. Are we banning Shurima Ionia, or are we leaving it open? This is usually where, like, the power level kind of falls off. Like, Reputation is good, but it's not Sivir Zed good. Frostbite Foundry and Frostbite Midrange are really good decks in the meta right now, because the second most popular deck after whatever Shurima Ionia pile your opponent brought is probably going to be Lee Sin, be it Akshan or Targon. Akshan Lee Sin's still not on the tier list because I kept eggs on here, and I didn't want to have 4 decks of the same regional combination, but, like, Lee Sin Akshan's fine. It's more vulnerable to Frost range, or Frostbite rather, because you only get the 1 turn of Overwhelm because of the Absolver, so you do have to be cognizant of that, and I think that as Lee Sin continues to be more popular, Lee Sin Akshan is just naturally going to get weeded out as the weaker Lee Sin deck to the things that beat Lee Sin, in terms of the Freljord style, because, like, Sivir does better against Targon Lee Sin than it does Shurima Lee Sin, but I think if you are playing Lee Sin in general, you shouldn't be leaving the Sivir open, so that's not really a concern of yours. Thralls has moved down a little bit in the power rankings. The power level of the deck is still very much there, but it's not doing as good as you want it to in Ionia meta. Because so many people are playing Deny, the chances that you're actually going to get off your promised future is a lot lower. But I still think this is like one of those sleeper decks of the meta where, like, people just, there's so many good decks right now that, like, fitting Thralls into your lineup feels like something that you have to want to do, and not something that is just organically good that you can throw in anything. But I mean, a triple Freljord lineup would probably look like Thralls, Foundry, and Frostbite midrange if that's the route that you wanted to go. Keep in a decent amount of Frostbite and try to beat out the Lee Sin deck, or maybe even the Sivir Zed if that's something that you think that you can do. I'm not super well versed in the Frostbite into Sivir matchup. I could see on paper how it goes either way, but I would assume that it's going to be a little bit more Sivir favored, dependent on how many spell shielded units they draw. Because if they draw like a Sivir and 2 Rowan Runner, I don't think Frostbite is getting through all of that. Karma Ezreal, I don't love this deck. I do think it's better than, like, the lowest tier on the tier list. I think it still deserves a spot on the tier list. It's probably, like, one of the worst Ionia decks out there, but that still means it's a pretty good deck, right? So if you're looking to run a triple Ionia lineup, like if you've got Lee Sin and Sivir, and for some reason you're like, yeah, you know, I just really want to run a 3rd Ionia deck, because you are locked out of Ionia Shurima, you're probably going to bring Karma Ezreal as the 3rd one, but I really don't think triple Ionia is the kind of lineup that you want to be going for right now. I don't think Deny is in a phenomenal place. There's just so many burst speed combat tricks that are defining the meta that I don't think you're really looking to bring 3 Deny for any particular reason. Let's talk about Viego a little bit. So the Viego Sacrifice deck is essentially just Thresh Nasus with Viego. Sometimes it still plays Nasus. It's a good Merciless Hunter deck, and I think that's what's kind of carrying it right now. I don't think the Viego really adds too much to the deck in terms of countering the meta, and I don't think the deck is so solid on its own that you should just be running it in a lineup. It had a good opening week, but I don't expect it to maintain the numbers that it put up. I think it was just kind of a flash in the pan. And then the Spooky Viego is cool, but it's got a lot of cards in there that are really inconsistent on paper. Like Greenglade Lookout, this is a card with diminishing returns the later you top deck it, and Deathmark. I mean, it's got the cool, you know, Dark Water Scourge Deathmark combo, but that's something that has been tried in a lot of shells, and while this is one of the best ones for it yet, because you have so many ephemerals with Camavoran, Soldier, and Viego, and Invasive Hydravine, that yes, Deathmark is probably the most consistent it's ever been, but I'm still not in love with it because there are, you know, so many ways to deal with the actual ephemeral unit between, like, Will of Ionia, but Will of Ionia is kind of at a low. A lot of players are going for Concussive Palm, so I think that the Deathmark does exploit a pretty weird weakness within the meta of just, like, a lack of Will of Ionia and all these combat tricks instead. So, you know, I am a bit of a bigger fan of this than I am the Shurima Viego, but I think that the natural inconsistencies of the deck can really catch up with you. It's got the same problem that Spooky Karma does, where it's a pretty good deck, but there are some hands that are just unplayable, and you don't really have a lot of ways to fix it. Granted, Spooky Viego does have a decent amount of draw power between Glimpse Beyond and Spirit Leeches because it is still a Viego deck, but things have to come together in the mid-game in a way that you cannot afford to flounder against Sivir or even Lee Sin. There's just a little bit too many, like, you are just not good enough in the mid-game to go toe-to-toe with a lot of the decks in the meta right now, and you can, if you get the right hand, but I don't think that's happening often enough for Spooky Viego to, like, really pick up in a big way. So that's kind of why it's down in tier 3. The consistency of it is just something that I'm not a big fan of, and maybe we'll find a little bit of a more streamlined build for it. Maybe we'll take out some of the more inconsistent cards like Green Glade Lookout, but Invasive Hydrovine earlier is just insane, and that's why I've never liked cards with diminishing returns. If you ever hear me talk about how much I hate 1-drops, it's not 1-drops that I hate, it's cards with diminishing returns, and 1-drops just overwhelmingly have diminishing returns in Legends of Runeterra, where, you know, every 1-drop feels good on turn 1. But a lot of them don't even feel good on, like, turn 4 or 5, which is still pretty early in the game. I should still be okay seeing my 1-drops then, which is why I'm such a big fan of things like Treasure Seeker. Treasure Seeker feels good no matter when I top deck. I can top deck that on turn 6, it's fine. It's coming down alongside my Ruin Runner. It's a great curve. But things like, you know, Legion Rearguard and, you know, like the 12 1-drop decks, I could never get behind because I just have so many top decks that have diminished returns that I can't handle it, which is why I'm still, like, you know, jury's out on Spooky Viego because of that Green Glade Lookout. And Chen Demacia I've seen Green Glade Lookout in as well, but players don't seem to be flocking to that one as hard as they do in the Viego deck. Let's talk a little bit about Nab, because this is something that I actually meant to put on the tier list last week and then just forgot. So these are the Freljord cards that I've seen in the list: Three Sisters, Babbling Beard, and Sejuani. Sejuani's mandatory, the other one's not so much. And this is something that players are really picking up on as like a counter to the Sivir decks in the meta, because of course Sejuani getting through Spell Shield is a pretty cool thing. Monster Harpoon is one of the most effective removal spells that we have right now, and Make It Rain is actually a great sort of free tool for popping spell shields. When you want to pop spell shields, you're looking for like cheap AoE, right? Like Ice Shard and Make It Rain are probably the best that you're going to get in terms of actually getting it done. And this deck has that. It doesn't have a lot of payoff for popping the spell shield outside of the Monster Harpoon, but hey, that's good enough. A lot of these cards are, like, the main deck is really flexible on this one. None of these are really mandatory. I've even seen Twisted Fate instead of Gangplank. I've seen Prowling Cutthroat instead of Crackshot Corsair. I don't know that you need Hired Gun because the attack on a lot of your units is just so little that you're probably not getting through really anything that you want to be challenging with the Hired Gun. Maybe it's more about pulling blockers out of the way with your monkeys so that things can get through. Monkey Idol, I don't even like. Monkey Idol's good, but with Merciless Hunter popping up in spades, it's a little questionable. But hey, you do need to turbo level that Sejuani and Gangplank, and that's how you're going to win a lot of your matchups, right? I mean, back in the day of Frostbite Foundry's first iterations, when it was just Teemo Sejuani, that was how you beat Lee Sin, was just getting Sejuani on board and, you know, having ways to proc the Sejuani throughout the... So, like, Sejuani does really good into the meta that we have, this Sivir Lee Sin meta that we're staring down, and that's kind of what this is, right? It's like this big counter pick deck that the... You know, the consistency is pretty good. The power level is a little questionable. We're not even running things like the Nab spell because it's just tempo efficient. We're really looking to just, like, run out units, survive the mid-game, get to the Sejuani, kind of bada bing, bada boom, wrap it all up. Zap Sprayfin isn't, like, necessarily standard in this deck either. You don't have any great things that you want to grab off of it, but because Shadow Assassin and Green Glade Duo and all that kind of elusive stuff is popping up so large right now, I think that Zap might be a worthy inclusion just so that you can play on the elusive field with your opponent. But yeah, I think Nab is a really cool pick for the weekend, especially if we are just expecting a lot more Sivir and a lot more Lee Sin, which is, you know, given what we saw last week, that should be what we're expecting. Eggs is in a weird spot where it did absolutely nothing last weekend. I don't even know if anybody entered with it. I don't know if anyone's going to enter with it this weekend. People are, like, really divided on this deck where everybody, like, knows it's broken, but nobody wants to play it. So jury's still out on Eggs. The build is probably outdated at this point because this is a deck that is, like, going under iterations constantly throughout every day. I don't even think they play Zillion anymore. I think they do, like, some Zephyr Sage WinCon thing. For those of you that are wondering, like, if this deck is going to get banned or hotfixed, like, they said that this kind of deck was intended. I don't know if the Navori Conspirator loop is intended or how that plays into the time rules with the seasonal and whatnot, but hey, we'll figure that one out next week when we see the balance patch, because this was something that the devs knew about going into the release of the new cards. Like, they were aware of this, they told us that, so we'll see how it goes. And then the other decks down in tier 3, like, I think Deep is probably the best one here. Overwhelm is great if you want a third Ruin Runner or third Merciless Hunter deck, but I don't think this is where you should be committing your Sivir. I think this is more so just looking to exploit weaknesses in the meta that are exploited by Ruin Runner and Merciless Hunter. Mostly control decks if we're talking about Ruin Runner, and then, you know, some of the more backline decks when we're talking about Merciless Hunter, which is why the meta is so, like, sharply different than it was previously. It's just you can't play backline champions anymore. because Merciless Hunter just gobbles them up. The one exception seems to be Azir Aurelia, where Azir is still a backline champion, and he's outside of the range of Merciless Hunter being able to kill it. Aurelia, sort of the same vein, where she, you know, she'll go into combat every now and then, but usually you get, like, dying the turn Aurelia comes down or the turn after, so she's not, like, as exploitable in my Merciless Hunter as something like Twisted Fate was. Spooky Viego, we already talked about. Deep is a pretty good counter to a few of the decks in the meta. Not really enough of them to be a major player, I think, but you shouldn't be surprised if you see somebody topping with Deep. It probably means that they hit the good matchups, or they high-rolled on the Deep deck in the bad matchups. Like, Deep is solid, don't get me wrong. There's a reason that Deep was left on the tier list, and I took off a couple of other things. Feel the Rush is really just getting put... Like, control in general is just kind of getting pushed out, especially, like, the hard control that Shadow Isle Freljord has always been, because of all the spell shields in the meta, because Lee Sin is in the meta, just so many denies. Like, this is what gets pushed out by the denies. This is the victim of Ionia being absolutely everywhere, is Feel the Rush, and maybe we'll get that back a little bit later, depending on what, you know, changes in the meta going into this, but ultimately, Feel the Rush is just, it's chilling, it's fine, it's not great. You probably shouldn't even be Feel the Rush, you should probably be like a Ladros deck instead, like the original TLC, the Trundle-Ladros combo. But yeah, ultimately not feeling the rush right now. But, you know, it does get into Draven Ezreal. So if that's something that you're looking for, Draven Ezreal really even hasn't been kind of doing what you would expect it to in a meta like this. But hey, that is what it is. So as we get into this last weekend, you know, it's really just like Lee Sin and Sivir are the two main things that you want to be looking at in terms of like ban strategy, counter picks, things to run in your lineup, decks to be familiar with intimately. Yeah, so that is going to do it for me. Thank you so much for watching and kind of bearing with me through this a little more all-over-the-place version of Tournament Tactician. Next week, things will be a lot more streamlined as we get... The seasonal is, like, here, man. Like, it's, like, 3 weeks away. Like, right? It's August 14th is the actual open rounds of the seasonal. It's already July 23rd. So, yeah, we're about 3 weeks out. So, about 2.5 weeks after the patch drops, we'll have 2 weeks of grassroots tournaments followed by the seasonal, if I've done my math correctly. So really not a lot of time. So the Tournament Tacticians going forward will really be like nailed down, hey, we're in the seasonal meta, here's what's going on. But for this last week, I wanted to be a little bit more all over the place. So thank you so much for watching. My name is Boulevard, and as always, good luck in your tournaments.